Asyle, the engineer, and the island. Week 47, Day 1. Back to the drizzle. I did a little foraging in the morning, despite the rain, and then returned to my microbiological studies. I noticed that after sterilizing and washing off some of the agar plates and reusing them, certain newly introduced microbes grew in uneven patterns, probably as a result of some of my testing compounds having diffused into the agar. In some ways it was annoying, but in others it saved me a little bit of work, and I just took some extra effort to make sure I remembered which quadrant of each petri dish had what chemicals on it, marking the dishes around the rim and leaving the center clear for initial inoculation, and as a control site for growth comparisons. After lunch, I put some final touches on my MIST book, going through and making sure that all the page references and ciphers worked correctly, as well as adding a few new ones, particularly failure conditions or options I never even thought of as potentially part of the game, like trying to swim out to sea around the islands. Some of these made the process of exploration feel more interesting and dangerous, like I remember from the various choose-your-own-adventure books I read as a kid. Unfortunately, it still wasn't entirely finished by the time I needed to go to bed. Week 47, Day 2. The sun came back out today, so I decided to make it a paper-making day. I did my morning chores, collected my plant material, and spent the day soaking, grinding, pressing, spinning, and swapping again. It was a bit monotonous, if busy, but I actually kind of liked it. I think I've gotten used to being busy all the time this past year, and as much as I appreciate the rest I've gotten these past few weeks writing, I also find myself still getting restless. And this kind of work helps me get a little bit of that energy out. I've also started storing extra lime down in the tunnels, where it'll be protected from moisture. Week 47, Day 3. Another bright sunny day. I did my morning chores and decided to do another mini maintenance day, since I wasn't able to do a maintenance run at the beginning of the month due to bad weather. I specifically decided to go through the kitchen this morning, tidying up and conducting minor repairs on the refrigeration system. I refilled it with ethanol, which was frankly overdue. Nevertheless, the cellar seems to have kept relatively cool, even without a lot of effort. I can only assume this is because of the stellar radiator, because I haven't been keeping the evaporator hot very often. Before lunch, I remembered to check on my soda bottles for carbonation, and some were better than others, both in terms of carbonation and flavor. I took the cultures that I liked best, divided them between the bottles, and proceeded to boil down a lot more sugar cane to begin making soda in bulk. I found several plants with interesting flavors, which I boiled and concentrated into syrups to flavor the different soda bottles over lunch, after which I filled up the bottles, pressurized them with my special corks, and left them to ferment in the panic room. After lunch, I decided to give the bathhouse a good cleaning too. I've been trying my best to clean up after myself every time I shower, and fortunately, a good deal of the water I've been using to wash myself has been distilled from seawater or rain, so there hasn't been much hard water to scrub away. However, algae and mold grow wherever they can, so I rinsed things down with some vinegar. I also noticed that I was running out of soap, shampoo, and toothpaste, so I spent a little time cooking up a big new batch of each. I had a few hours to kill at the end of the day, so I spent them putting some finishing touches on my MIST book, not just adding a few more pages, but also binding the pages, wrapping the cover in some gray, dyed cloth, and painting on the title so that it looked like an actual Myst linking book. In the end, I was pretty pleased with it, and though I'm probably unlikely to reread it very often, I expect when I do, I'll find new conditions I can add to it, so I made sure the binding was suitably loose so I could add more pages if I needed to. Week 47, Day 4. Heavy rain today, so after tending to the vortex drill, I resumed my microbiological studies. The fungal specimens had plenty of time to grow in the past week, and I could get a good look at their hyphae structures. They were quite beautiful and fascinating, but I couldn't really think of any practical uses for them. Most are not going to be edible, nor am I aware of them producing any particularly useful biological compounds, besides maybe penicillin. But I've already got my phage collections for that, which I'm still growing, concentrating, and selectively breeding. It's kind of weird that an action so simple, just picking the ones that grow the best, or worse in this case, can be so powerful. Back to the fungi, though. The only thing I could think of for making fungi useful was as a biodegradable replacement for styrofoam packaging, which some companies on the mainland have been experimenting with, but I don't really need that here. For now, all I can really do is, again, keep an eye open for fungal specimens that are growing more poorly than others, so I can isolate, culture, and breed their viral counteragents. Considering the practical uses of fungi, however, caused me to turn back to the study of yeasts. I know that many yeasts that are safe to eat are floating around in the air everywhere. That's how bread was traditionally leavened, and particularly sourdough bread today. And as part of a project I was strongly considering a long time ago, yeasts produce all the essential amino acids a person needs to function, and are already used to make nutritional yeast supplements that are sometimes used as a flavoring or cheese substitute in vegan diets, so perhaps I could do the same. The only problem with nutritional yeast is that it has a lot of glutamates in it, which are responsible for giving it its rich umami flavor, but in excessive quantities can cause seizures by creating neurochemical imbalances, I believe. Since I can taste glutamates, though, I can probably selectively breed the cultures for reduced glutamate production, and use the nutritional yeast in moderation. Even so, that's one more way to expand my food supply and diversify my diet. Besides, I'm far past the acceptance stage of having gotten all my protein from fish and eggs for the past year. I think sugars and starches are mostly what yeasts eat, though they must need an additional source of nitrogen to make proteins. So I mashed up a little yam, taro, and some of the molasses left over from making soda the other day, and separated them into different petri dishes in place of agar to see which kind the yeasts liked best, sterilizing them in a pressure cooker and inoculating them with different cultures of the various yeast species I've managed to isolate so far. I then left them to grow in the incubator for a while. I'm not sure how long they'll take to grow, but I'll keep an eye on the dishes to see when the growing medium appears to be fully consumed. Maybe about a week. All that thought about nutritional yeasts, and cheeses especially, made me hungry for lunch. Afterwards, with my Myst book pretty much finished, I considered moving on to another writing project, but I was actually a little burnt out, as fun as the last one was, so I won't be moving on to Riven right away. I thought about trying to make another board game or something, but the only game I could think of off the top of my head that I had any interest in replicating was Half-Life. And the more I thought about it, the more I thought that it actually might be better suited to a choose-your-own-adventure book style than something like a tabletop RPG. Yes, it is a first-person shooter, But aside from that being all but impossible for me to replicate on a piece of paper, the heart of Half-Life has always been the tactical use of weapons and environment, at least to me, and never really about precision shooting or platforming. My personal playstyle of save scumming certainly feels a lot closer to a turn-based game than a real-time one. With that in mind, I decided to tweak my choose-your-own-adventure book mechanics just a little, and added a character sheet to the book I started writing, where the player must keep track of their health and ammo. The strategies they use during different encounters will determine how much of each they lose. Sneakier and environmental strategies may not use any at all. The addition of dice and modifiers to the different weapons saved me from having to write a different branching story path for every weapon that players could use at every turn. Different weapons do more or less damage than others, have different ranges, and different accuracy penalties depending on the range they're fired over, which basically costs more ammo. Another thing that I thought made Half-Life better as a choose-your-own-adventure book than a tabletop RPG was that the claustrophobic and twisting passages of the Black Mesa facility form a maze that's difficult to keep track of in your head because you can't see everything all at once, along with a lot of one-way doors that prevent backtracking, compared to a tabletop RPG where you have an overhead map of what you're working with and can move freely in 2 dimensions. Furthermore, gunfights are so fast, both in games and in real life, that they're basically over in 1 or 2 turns anyway, so I figured I might as well make it 1 turn, and force players to use the resources they have tactically, including cover and exploding barrels. The story of Half-Life is also pretty linear, which again makes it easier to write. With the mechanics more or less figured out, I spent most of the afternoon writing and tweaking the balance of the different encounters as I went. While I started out bouncing between the different encounters I could remember, when I started writing from the beginning, with the anomalous materials chapter, there wasn't a lot of combat, mostly writing just to set the scene, though I didn't forget to include the option to blow up Dr. Magnuson's microwave casserole. I still used my cipher mechanic to give the next page number to turn to, but this time I decided to hide the options a bit more carefully than just giving an encoded list at the bottom of the page, because that would tell players how many options they had. Instead, besides having a basic series of text commands like forward, backtrack, cover, etc., I basically made different keywords in the text also function as solutions to the cipher, though I didn't give any particular indication in the text that these could be interacted with. For example, just adding the word microwave to the cipher gives the page number to turn to for the exploding casserole outcome, but it wasn't underlined or anything in the body text. With these ciphers becoming increasingly complex, however, I found I needed a way to make sure that players wouldn't pick the wrong word from the text and get sent to a page that made no sense or spoil the ending. I considered adding something like a checksum function on keywords, or equations that produced negative or very large values that couldn't possibly be the correct page number, but I found this was too much work for both me to write and for players to figure out, so I just left the nonsense solutions for players to realize they'd made a mistake from. The pages are going to be all mixed up and out of chronological order anyway. Week 47, Day 5. The rain let up today, but it was still kind of overcast. I did some foraging in the morning before getting back to my microbiological studies. In particular, thinking about the possibility of making food from yeast has gotten me excited about other potentially renewable food supplies, which will be good not only for, say, the underwater dome, but as a backup in case something goes majorly wrong with my gardens. I doubt I'll be able to make anything quite as sophisticated as the microbial food synthesizer machine I'd come up with long before coming to the island, but I think maybe I could come up with something a bit simpler that performs a similar role. Firstly, it didn't escape my attention that it's kind of silly to feed my yeast taro or molasses, because I could just eat those plants myself and they would have all the raw ingredients for building proteins in them already, though my body may not always be able to synthesize them by itself, in which case those yeast cultures would actually do more good inside my digestive tract. As such, it would be far better if I could create sugars for the yeast to feed on using algae, which are much more efficient at producing sugar than sugarcane, because they don't waste as much of their energy in materials growing stems and leaves. Algae, specifically cyanobacteria, have been used to mass-produce sugar in the past, mostly for fermentation by, again, yeast for making biofuel, which I always thought was kind of silly when we could be using that sugar to make food. I'm not sure if I can directly recreate those kinds of bacteria, because they were genetically engineered to overproduce sugars, but I expect that with some time and selective breeding, I might be able to get close, especially if I can develop some means of introducing random mutations, even if I can't read or predict what those mutations are. To avoid mutating myself, this would have to be either through radiation or viruses, though bacteria already exchange a lot of genetic information through plasmids, which I might also be able to use to control their genes. Secondly, even if I can get the algae to feed sugars and oxygen to the yeasts, forming a sort of tiny self-sustaining biosphere between them, the yeast still isn't going to be able to make proteins in that closed environment without nitrogen, as well as other essential organic elements like phosphorus and sulfur. If they're going to be used for food, I'm going to need other vitamins and minerals too, but let's start small for now. However, I am aware that certain kinds of bacteria are capable of fixing nitrogen from the atmosphere into ammonia to help fertilize the soil for plants. I'm pretty sure yeast can absorb ammonia too, so if I can add those bacteria to the mix, I should be able to make a mostly self-sustaining, solar-powered, food-producing microcosm. This is going to take some time and a lot of selective breeding, so I made myself a little roadmap of what'll need to be done. I don't expect this plan to work completely, but it gives me something to do, and at this point into my stay on the island, there's something to be said for just doing stuff for the heck of it, whether it actually succeeds or not. Even if it fails, I'm probably going to learn a lot. As I mentioned, I need to selectively breed the yeasts for reduced glutamate production, safe digestion, and overall maximum nutrition. I can taste the resulting cultures to determine glutamate content, but to determine whether or not they're safe for direct consumption, as opposed to simply cooking them to death before eating, I don't think there's anything I can do except conduct clinical trials on myself. This is a bit of a gamble, but I suspect I can kill any potential yeast infections in my digestive system by either drinking vinegar, which should both kill the yeast and help flush me out, as well as continuing to culture phages specific to every culture I'm producing, giving me a good, repetitious protocol for every single one of my biological experiments. As for testing the total amount of useful nutrients present, I think the best thing I can do for that is add a different, protein-loving species of bacteria to a given culture and see how well it grows. The more it grows, the more protein is being produced by the yeast culture. For the algae, I need to not only identify and isolate different species, several of which I've happened upon already, but I also need to create some natural selection conditions for them that'll encourage them to produce as much sugar as possible and on as little sunlight as possible. This will require two different testing protocols. The first is to expose the algae to progressively lower light levels. and culturing those algae that were able to survive on less sunlight over and over again, until I get a breed that can grow almost as well as normal in low light conditions, before starting the whole process over again. Though I also need to confirm that they'll still grow well in normal light conditions as I go. Don't want to turn them into troglodytes. I can reduce light levels easily and in a controlled fashion by basically putting the petri dishes at the bottom of a bamboo tube. The longer the tube, the less light will scatter down to reach the algae. The second protocol is to add another non-photosynthetic species of microbe to the culture to measure approximately how much sugar the algae are excreting. Again, more neighbors means more sugars being produced, and those cultures will be selected for continued breeding and selection. I'll also experiment with using a mixed culture of algae species, as this will increase the likelihood of them sharing DNA via plasmid or viral exchange. On the topic of viral genetic exchange, I had an idea for one additional protocol for my tests, where I would not only select the cultures with the most virulent phages to the target species, but also the weakest. The idea is that the weak phages may be better at infecting their hosts without killing them, which increases the likelihood of random genetic exchange and mutations, which I can use for these experiments. Finally, for the nitrogen-fixing bacteria, I'll have to identify them by the presence of ammonia in the cultures. Normally the concentrations are going to be so low that I could never detect them, but ammonia is alkaline, which will make the culture more electrically conductive and drive specific electrolytic reactions. I can use a zinc and carbon electrode to test for this, though the voltage will be so small that I'll probably need to use an electrolytic transistor to amplify it. For now, I think I can just borrow a transistor from the radio while it's not being used, so I don't have to do any more mining. Alternatively, I can use the growth of neighboring yeast cultures to help gauge the presence of ammonia as opposed to other compounds I might not want the fixers to be producing. Besides, it'll artificially select them to encourage the yeast's growth specifically, regardless of what compounds they actually produce, which is what I want. With this new project and set of testing protocols nailed down, I prepared a new notebook with these protocols written in them, as well as sections for describing each generation of microbes as I produce them. I'm not sure how long it'll take for the desired traits to begin appearing in each culture, if they appear at all, but if they're basically able to double in number every 10 or 20 minutes, they'll be experiencing roughly 100 generations per day, 700 in a week, or 2,800 generations in a month. In comparison, my understanding is that it can take only a handful of generations for something like a bird, fish, or even something like dogs to form new morphs or breeds in response to natural and artificial selection pressures respectively, depending on how strong they are. Call it 10 generations on average. If microorganisms follow a similar pattern, I may be getting useful variations and mutations on a daily basis, and how strong those selection pressures are will basically be dependent on how many ways I split the cultures each generation, the more the better. But for now, I can only spare 7 petri dishes per culture experiment. I therefore proceeded to separate my petri dishes into 3 groups for the 3 different microbe cultures I wanted to begin engineering, before sterilizing and inoculating them with mixed cultures I'd already identified as likely candidates for the tests. I'm counting on natural/artificial selection to separate the best ones for my application over time, which will probably be at least a month if I'm lucky. I had lunch after this, and while this is normally when I'd take a break and get back to writing, honestly, the Half-Life Choose Your Own Adventure book wasn't grabbing me today. Instead, I decided I wanted to go to the workshop and grind down some more petri dishes for a total of 42. This way, I'll be able to divide my cultures by an even 10 with each generation, accelerating the rate of natural selection in them, while still having 12 left over for continued research on other microbe species. I then went for another dive to collect seaweed before cooking it down into agar and inoculating the new plates. Only after that did I spend the last couple of hours of the day writing, and unfortunately, I started to have some fun with it and had to go to bed before I finished writing down all my ideas for the unforeseen consequences chapter. Week 47, Day 6. The weather was clear as a bell today, so I decided to do some more glass work, especially since I'll be needing new test tubes for storing phage cultures. I was torn, though, between that and making more potassium superoxide, as my diving suit is probably starting to get a little low on it by now, in spite of how short I've generally tried to keep my diving expeditions. I ultimately decided that test tubes were a little more urgent, so I put superoxide on my to-do list for the next sunny day. First, however, I did my morning chores and went through my testing protocols for my 3 microbe experiments. So far, the results are marginal, but I did my due diligence and picked the cultures that were doing the best. By the time I was done, however, it was time for lunch. The kiln was well warmed up by then, so I collected some sand and spent the remainder of the afternoon blowing test tubes in the heat. Didn't get quite as much done as I expected I would. At the end of the day, I took a break and did some writing before getting ready for bed. Week 47, Day 7. It's Sabbath again, and it rained lightly today. When I changed out the sand from the reservoir around the vortex drill this morning, I was encouraged by the fact that the water felt warm. This suggests that I'm finally getting closer to a consistent source of energy. I then conducted my microbe testing protocols before listening to the sermon on the radio, transcribing my records, and going down to the underwater dome to have lunch with the sharks. I then returned to my office and spent the rest of the afternoon writing the Office Complex chapter of the game, where you at least get to see a few friendly faces. I had to add some mechanics to account for the security guards and scientists you could bring with you. They kind of work like additional guns, but they also have health. The scientists don't do anything, and may sponge up health packs if you decide to give some to them, but I think generosity is its own reward for players in this kind of situation. I also tried to add some extra dialogue for these characters, and give them names to make them feel a bit more real than in the original game. It had a weird little effect on me, as such writing often does, simultaneously making me feel a little less alone through the roleplay, but at the same time highlighting how actually alone I am here. I'm not sure how to feel about that anymore. It seems wrong somehow to even ask, but if the point is just to alleviate the feeling of loneliness, does it matter whether the people are real or not? Is my perception more important in this context than the reality? Of course, I've always been hyper-aware that this is a very slippery slope into actual madness, which I think I've been able to evade up to this point. Still, if I must continue writing this way, I must also proceed with caution. Blooper Reel. Some of me. I've also started storing extra lime down in the tunnels, where I also noticed that I was running out of soap. I also noticed that I was running out. A had a few hours to kill. How did I make that mistake? It's on the opposite side of the keyboard. Separated them into different petri dish. Okay, there's a typo there. Resume. Oh, my nose itches. That came out of nowhere. And never really about precision. And never really about precision. Good morning, Gordon. My voice is not woken up this morning, but that's what I get. And added a character sheet to the book I started writing. Need to make some edits, hold on.
Why do we all have to wear these ridiculous ties?
Sneakier and environment. Sneakier. That's hard to say. Also, if you're a fan of Half-Life, go play the fan-made Black Mesa remake because it's amazing. And now I've reached the end of my Google Doc because there's a max character limit. Eat my shorts. Certainly a sign that I'm in the home stretch, though. Whoop. That's where it stops. That's where it stops. Stop! Stop! Which I always thought was kind of silly when we could be using that sugar to make food. Also, as a quick side note, apparently the biofuel industry is incredibly inefficient. That you basically put more energy into growing something like corn for biofuels than you actually get from burning the finished biofuel. So it's all just a big mistake. The more you know. I need to not only identify and isolate different species, several which have happened, and culturing those out. It'll artificially select them to encourage the yeast's growth.
Oh, thank you, Gordon. I was in dire need of some toilet paper.
Hey there. Thanks for listening all the way to the end, and for sitting through all of my Dr. Kleiner impressions. Here's hoping that my experiments in edible microbes don't end up having any unforeseen consequences of their own. If you want to see how those experiments turn out, though, you can press the like, subscribe, and bell buttons to get a heads up when the next episode is ready. Now, I don't want to ask you to take me on an escort mission or anything, but if you're willing, it would really help me out, more than anything else, if you could share this video with someone who you think would enjoy it, since I'm still looking for someone to play with on multiplayer in real life, even though multiplayer games normally make me so nervous that I actually chickened out of playing Crosscode and even Stardew Valley of all things. If you'd like to chat about some of your own stories and perspectives on the episode, maybe about some of your own gaming experiences or attempts to culture microbes to practical purposes, please feel free to share them in the comments section below. I genuinely love to hear them, and I'm always open to suggestions and corrections. That said, thanks again for listening, and hope to see you here again next week.